September 21st, 1327. The village of Berkeley, Gloucestershire, England. It is past midnight. The people of Berkeley are woken by screaming. It comes from the castle on the hill above their village. One voice, a man's voice. The kind of sound that does not come from a bad dream. The kind of sound that, once you have heard it, you do not forget. By dawn, the screaming has stopped. A few hours later, a messenger leaves Berkeley Castle and rides hard for London. The message he carries will be delivered to a 14-year-old boy who is, technically, the King of England. The message tells him that his father, the former King Edward II, has died in the night, peacefully, of natural causes. The village of Berkeley heard the screams. Natural causes, the message said. Natural causes. Nobody in Berkeley believed it. Nobody in England believed it. And nearly 700 years later, historians still argue about exactly what happened in that room and whether the man who screamed actually died at all. Berkeley Castle sits in the Vale of Berkeley in Gloucestershire, a quiet stretch of English countryside between Bristol and Gloucester. It is not the largest castle in England. It is not the most dramatically positioned. It does not loom over a city or command a river crossing. It sits, somewhat modestly, in its valley, surrounded by farmland and the village that shares its name. And it has been owned by the same family since 1153, 870 years of continuous ownership by the Berkeley family. Generation after generation, the castle has passed from father to son to grandson, surviving wars, rebellions, the Reformation, the Civil War, 2 world wars, and every other catastrophe English history could throw at it. The current Lord Berkeley still lives here. The castle is still his home. This extraordinary continuity is part of what makes Berkeley so unsettling. In a country full of castles that were eventually abandoned, ruined, or converted, Berkeley is still inhabited by the family that received it in the 12th century. The stones of this building have been in the care of one family longer than most nations have existed. The castle you see today is largely 12th and 14th century construction, solid, functional, built for serious purposes rather than display. The Great Hall, the Keep, the inner courtyard, and one particular room on the upper floor of the keep that the Berkeley family refers to, with studied understatement, simply as Edward's room. That room is where a king was held prisoner for several months, and where something happened that the official record called natural causes, and the entire kingdom called murder. To understand what happened at Berkeley Castle, you need to understand Edward II, because his murder, if it was a murder, did not come from nowhere. It was the end point of one of the most catastrophically unsuccessful reigns in English history. Edward II became king in 1307 when his father, the formidable Edward I, died. Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, was a man of iron will and ferocious competence. His son was neither of these things. Edward II's great problem was his favourites. The first was Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight who had been Edward's companion since boyhood. Edward showered Gaveston with titles, wealth, and influence far beyond what his rank deserved. He reportedly called his own wife, the French princess Isabella, "my dear heart," a term he also used publicly for Gaveston. When Edward was crowned, he spent more time looking at Gaveston than at his new queen. What is beyond dispute is that the English barons loathed Gaveston with a passion that eventually proved fatal. They found him arrogant, they resented his influence, and they decided to deal with him. In 1312, a group of barons captured Gaveston and beheaded him on a hillside. Edward was devastated. He carried the grief for the rest of his life, and he learned nothing from it. Within a few years, he had replaced Gaveston with Hugh Despenser the Younger, another royal favourite who accumulated power and enemies with equal speed. His queen, Isabella, was intelligent, politically shrewd, and increasingly dangerous. In 1325, she was sent to France and simply did not come back. She took a lover, Roger Mortimer, and began planning. In September 1326, Isabella and Mortimer invaded England with a small army. Edward's support collapsed almost immediately. His favourite Hugh Despenser was captured. Despenser was subjected to a spectacular public execution involving castration and disemboweling while still alive. Edward himself fled westward, was captured in Wales, and brought back to face what was coming. In January 1327, Edward II was forced to abdicate the throne. He was 42 years old. His 14-year-old son became Edward III, and Edward II was sent to Berkeley Castle. Edward was housed in a room in the keep, Edward's Room, as it is known today, and the initial conditions, while not comfortable for a king, were not specifically brutal. That changed. Accounts from the period describe the conditions deteriorating deliberately. Edward was moved to a cell directly above an open pit. Into this pit, the rotting carcasses of dead animals had been thrown. The stench was extraordinary, described as enough to make a man ill simply from breathing the air. Edward II, whatever his failings as a king, was physically robust. He enjoyed physical labor and activities considered beneath a king's dignity. The rotting pit below his cell didn't kill him. There were also attempts to rescue him. A group of men known as the Dunheved Gang, led by a Dominican friar, twice managed to break into Berkeley Castle and briefly free him. Both times he was recaptured. Isabella and Mortimer needed him contained, not just dead. A living escaped Edward could rally support and challenge the regency. But by late summer of 1327, something had shifted. Edward was proving impossible to kill passively. The men in charge decided that the situation needed to be resolved more definitively. What actually happened to Edward II on the night of September 21st, 1327, is one of the great unresolved questions of history. The official account, natural causes, was never believed. The most contemporary accounts are vague. They note that he died. They note the suspicious circumstances. But the specific method is where the debate becomes genuinely complicated. The story that has come down through history is this. He was murdered with a red-hot iron poker inserted into his bowels through a horn. He died in agony. His screams were heard across Berkeley. His body, when displayed publicly afterward, showed no external wounds, which was, of course, the point. It was a deliberate attempt to avoid evidence of murder. This account had a particular resonance given the rumors about Edward's favorites. Killing a man by this method carried a symbolic brutality that contemporaries understood immediately. But the red-hot poker story first appears in written form at least 25 years later, in a chronicle by Geoffrey Le Baker. He was drawing on oral tradition and earlier sources. What we can say with reasonable confidence, Edward II did not die of natural causes. He was killed, and the people responsible, Isabella and Mortimer, had both motive and means. Edward's body was embalmed and kept at Berkeley for several months before being transferred to Gloucester for burial. The truth of that night died with the people in that room. His tomb, in what is now Gloucester Cathedral, is one of the finest royal effigies in England, a serene, idealized image of a king in repose. The tomb became a major pilgrimage site. People came from across England to pray at it. Whether from genuine devotion or fascination with a story that everyone knew was not what the official record claimed, the tomb drew them. Sometime between 1336 and 1338, a decade after Edward II's supposed death, a letter arrived at the court of his son, Edward III. It was written by Manuel de Fieschi, a notary in the papal court. The Fieschi Letter claimed that Edward II had not died at Berkeley Castle at all. It claimed that a servant had been killed in his place and that Edward had escaped, disguised himself, and fled. The letter described, in specific detail, the route Edward allegedly took, first to Ireland, then to France, eventually settling as a hermit in a small community in the hills of Lombardy. The letter claimed that Edward II, King of England, was alive and living as a hermit in Italy 10 years after his reported death. Now, this could be dismissed as a hoax, except for several things. First, The letter is genuine. It survives in the archives in Montpellier, France. It is not a forgery. Manuel de Fieschi was a real person with genuine access to the papal court. Second, the letter contains specific, verifiable details about Edward's imprisonment at Berkeley that were not common knowledge. Details only someone with direct knowledge could have known. Third, in 1878, an Italian historian discovered a document referring to a hermit called William the Englishman, who had lived in exactly the area described by the Fieschi Letter. Edward III received the Fieschi Letter and did, as far as the historical record shows, absolutely nothing with it. Whether because he knew it was false or because he knew it was true, we cannot say. Was the man who screamed in Berkeley Castle actually Edward II? Or was it someone else, a servant, a prisoner, murdered in his place? We do not know. Most historians remain skeptical, but the possibility of escape must at minimum be considered. The truth died with the people in that room. We may never know. Whatever the truth about Edward II's death, the people who had orchestrated it did not go unpunished forever. For 3 years, young Edward III was king in name only. The real power was held by his mother Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer. Edward was watched, managed, and kept away from real authority. He was the face of the crown, while Mortimer ran the country. In October 1330, Edward III was 17 years old and had had enough. Working with a small group of loyal friends, he carried out one of the most audacious operations in medieval English history. Nottingham Castle had a secret underground tunnel that led from outside the walls into the castle interior. Edward and his men used it. They entered at night, moved through the corridors, and burst into Isabella's chambers. Mortimer was seized on the spot. Isabella reportedly cried out, "Fair son, have pity on the gentle Mortimer," begging her son not to harm her lover. Edward did not listen. Mortimer was arrested, taken to London, tried, and hanged at Tyburn. He was denied the courtesy of a formal beheading, an additional humiliation for a man who had wielded near royal power. Isabella was placed under comfortable house arrest for the rest of her life. She was removed entirely from political life. She died in 1358, still maintaining whatever version of events she had decided on. Edward III ruled England for 50 years. He never publicly addressed what happened to his father. He never acknowledged the Fieschi Letter. He built the most glorious court in Europe. He left the question of Berkeley Castle unanswered for the rest of his life. Berkeley Castle gives you a murder that everyone knew about and nobody admitted.